It was the easiest $50 anyone had ever given me, and the most expensive mistake my family had ever made. My name is Margaret Collins. I was 62 years old on the day my younger brother Ethan graduated from college. And if you had walked into that auditorium and looked at me, you probably would have believed the same thing everyone else did. You would have seen a woman in a simple navy blue dress that had already been hanging in her closet for several years. You would have noticed sensible shoes instead of designer heels. You would have seen silver strands woven through my hair and a face that looked tired from long nights and too much responsibility. What you would not have seen was the email sitting unopened on my phone. What you would not have known was that less than 20 minutes earlier, while families were finding their seats and taking photos beside banners and balloons, a wire transfer worth $20 million had been approved. But nobody in my family knew that. As far as they were concerned, I was the cautionary tale. The woman who had once been successful and then disappeared from the spotlight. The woman whose business had struggled. The woman who lived quietly and never talked about money. The woman they pitied. The ceremony took place on a warm May afternoon in Raleigh, North Carolina. The campus was crowded with proud parents, grandparents, siblings, and friends. Everywhere I looked, people were carrying flowers, congratulatory cards, and cameras. The atmosphere felt hopeful, joyful, like the beginning of something new. I genuinely felt happy for Ethan. Despite our age difference, I had always looked after him. When our father passed away years earlier, I helped pay for some of Ethan's expenses when money was tight. I never kept score. Family isn't supposed to work that way. I arrived early and found my seat several rows behind the rest of the family. That wasn't unusual anymore. Over the years, little things had changed. Invitations arrived later. Decisions were made without me. Conversations seemed to stop whenever I entered a room. Nobody was openly cruel. It was subtler than that, harder to explain. The kind of treatment that leaves no visible bruise but still hurts. I watched Ethan cross the stage and accept his diploma. The crowd erupted with applause. I stood and cheered louder than anyone. For a moment, I forgot all the small slights. For a moment, I was simply a proud sister. After the ceremony ended, everyone gathered on the lawn for photos. Ethan was smiling. My mother Patricia looked emotional. Vanessa Brooks, Ethan's fiancée, moved through the crowd like she owned the event. Vanessa had a talent for making every situation revolve around her. She always knew where the cameras were. She always knew who was watching. And she always seemed to have a carefully crafted performance ready. We posed for pictures beneath a large oak tree near the administration building. The photographer adjusted everyone into place. Then Vanessa suddenly clapped her hands together and announced that she had one more surprise before dinner. Several relatives turned toward her with interest. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a small white envelope. "Margaret," she said with a sympathetic smile, "we all wanted to do something nice for you." The tone of her voice immediately caught my attention. It was the same tone people use when donating old furniture or dropping spare change into a charity jar. Before I could respond, she continued, "We know things have been difficult lately, and we wanted you to know the family cares." A few people nodded. Someone even murmured, "That's thoughtful." Vanessa handed me the envelope. I opened it. Inside was a $50 bill. Just one. For a second, nobody spoke. Then several relatives began smiling as though they had just witnessed a beautiful act of generosity. I looked around and saw expressions that bothered me far more than the money itself. Pity. Genuine pity. They believed I needed help. They believed I was struggling. They believed I should be grateful. Vanessa gently squeezed my arm. "Use it for something nice," she said. The photographer laughed awkwardly. A cousin smiled. My mother looked uncomfortable but said nothing. I simply folded the bill and slipped it back into the envelope. Then I smiled. Not because I was hurt. Not because I was angry. Because at that exact moment, my phone vibrated inside my purse. Quietly, almost invisibly. Nobody noticed. Nobody cared. But when I glanced down at the screen a few seconds later, I saw 6 words that changed everything. Wire transfer confirmed. $20 million received. I lifted my eyes and looked at the family surrounding me. They thought they knew exactly who I was. They thought the story was already finished. They had no idea it was just beginning. I did not mention the message on my phone during dinner. I did not mention the wire transfer. I did not mention the 18 months of work that had led to that moment. Instead, I slipped my phone back into my purse and followed everyone to the restaurant as though nothing unusual had happened. The celebration was held at a popular steakhouse about 15 minutes from campus. The dining room was crowded with other families celebrating graduations, promotions, and milestones. Laughter bounced off the walls. Servers carried trays filled with food. The atmosphere felt warm and festive, at least on the surface. Our family occupied a long table near the back of the room. Ethan sat in the center beside Vanessa, enjoying the attention that came with being the graduate. I was seated near the end of the table. Years ago, I would have been sitting beside my mother. Years ago, people would have asked for my opinions. Years ago, I had been part of every important conversation. Somewhere along the way, that changed. I watched everyone settle into their seats while the envelope containing the $50 remained untouched in my purse. Nobody asked whether I appreciated the gift. Nobody asked whether I actually needed it. They simply assumed. It struck me that assumptions can become powerful things when repeated often enough. After a while, people stopped questioning them. Vanessa was the first to bring up money. She leaned back in her chair and smiled at Ethan. "The job market is rough right now," she said. "A lot of people never recover from one bad business decision." Her eyes drifted toward me for a fraction of a second before returning to the group. The message was subtle. The target was not. A few relatives nodded knowingly. One of my cousins added that financial security was fragile. Another mentioned how difficult it was for older professionals to start over. They spoke as though I were not sitting there, as though my life were a case study instead of a lived experience. I focused on my iced tea and listened. The funny thing was that most of them only knew a small piece of my story. Years earlier, I had experienced a failed venture that cost me more than money. It cost me confidence. It cost me relationships. It cost me the version of myself that believed success was permanent. But failure can be a remarkable teacher. While others were busy discussing what I had lost, they never bothered to ask what I had learned. Across the table, my mother remained unusually quiet. Patricia was 84 now, and age had softened many of her opinions. More than once I caught her looking at me with an expression that suggested discomfort. I wondered if she sensed something was wrong. Not with me, with the way the family treated me. Then Vanessa laughed and said, "At least Margaret knows we are looking out for her." Several people smiled. Someone raised a glass. I smiled too, not because the comment amused me, but because I suddenly understood something important. They did not see me as a threat. They did not see me as an equal. They had reduced me to a story they told themselves. A woman whose best years were behind her. A woman who needed help. A woman who should feel grateful for scraps of attention and small acts of charity. Meanwhile, the largest business achievement of my entire life sat quietly inside my purse, hidden behind a locked screen. And for the first time all evening, I realized I was not embarrassed by what had happened on the lawn. I was fascinated by it, because people reveal their true character when they think you have nothing left to offer. As dinner continued, the conversations around the table began revealing more than the people speaking intended. That is the thing about confidence. When people believe they have accurately measured your worth, they stop being careful. They stop hiding what they really think. Ethan was busy answering questions about his future plans. Relatives offered advice. Friends stopped by the table to congratulate him. The attention remained focused on him, which was exactly how it should have been. It was his day, yet every so often, Vanessa found a way to redirect the conversation toward me. Not directly, never directly. She was too skilled for that. Instead, she wrapped her comments in concern. She asked whether I was keeping busy these days. She wondered aloud whether retirement might actually be healthier than continuing to chase business opportunities. She spoke with the gentle voice people use when discussing someone who has already accepted defeat. Several family members nodded in agreement. I simply listened. Years ago, those comments would have bothered me. Years ago, I might have felt compelled to defend myself. But 18 months of rebuilding had changed something inside me. I had spent too many nights alone in conference rooms. Too many mornings reviewing contracts before sunrise. Too many weekends solving problems nobody else believed could be solved. Somewhere during that process, I stopped needing validation. Success became quieter, more personal, more durable. Across the table, my cousin Brian leaned toward me. "I heard you were working on something new," he said. "How is that going?" Before I could answer, Vanessa laughed softly. "Margaret is always working on something," she said. "She just likes staying busy." The comment sounded harmless. Most people at the table probably thought it was harmless. But I noticed the way she smiled afterward. I noticed how quickly the subject changed. She did not want anyone asking questions. She preferred the version of me that existed inside her narrative. The unsuccessful older sister. The cautionary example. The woman who needed $50 and encouragement. I looked around the restaurant. Families were celebrating everywhere. Parents taking pictures. Grandparents hugging graduates. Children laughing near the entrance. It reminded me of something I had not thought about in years. Perception is often inherited. One person creates a story. Others repeat it. Eventually, it becomes accepted as truth. Looking back, I realized that had happened to me little by little. Nobody woke up one morning and decided to dismiss me. It happened through hundreds of small moments. Missed invitations, assumptions, jokes disguised as concern, explanations offered when none were requested. Vanessa had simply learned how to guide those moments. My phone remained silent in my purse. The transfer was complete. The contracts were signed. The future I had spent 18 months building was now real. Yet none of that occupied my thoughts. What fascinated me was the realization that nobody at the table seemed interested in who I actually was. They were interacting with a character they had created. A simplified version of Margaret Collins. Easier to understand. Easier to pity. Easier to overlook. Then my mother finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Margaret always surprises people," she said. The table fell silent for a second. Vanessa smiled politely. "That is true," she replied. "She certainly does." Something in the way those words were spoken made me look up. For the first time all evening, I had the strange feeling that the story everyone believed was beginning to crack. My mother's comment lingered in the air long after the conversation moved on. Most people at the table seemed to dismiss it, but I noticed Vanessa's expression tighten for the briefest moment. It disappeared almost instantly, replaced by the same polished smile she wore whenever she wanted to appear gracious. A server arrived with dinner plates, and the noise of the restaurant returned. Glasses clinked. Conversations overlapped. Ethan began discussing a job opportunity he hoped to pursue after graduation. Everyone focused on him again, yet I found myself drifting into memories. There had been a time when my family viewed me differently. 20 years earlier, I had been the person relatives called when they needed advice. I was the one organizing family gatherings, helping with tuition payments, offering guidance during difficult seasons of life. Success had never made me feel superior. If anything, it made me feel responsible. When people needed help, I helped. When opportunities appeared, I shared them. Back then, nobody questioned whether I belonged at the table. Then came a series of setbacks. A partnership dissolved. A company I believed in failed. An investment took longer to recover than expected. None of those events ruined me financially, but they changed the story people told about me. Gradually, every accomplishment was forgotten and every mistake became permanent. Vanessa entered the family during that period. By the time she arrived, the narrative had already started forming. She simply perfected it. Looking back, I could identify dozens of moments that seemed insignificant at the time. Family dinners where my suggestions were ignored until someone else repeated them. Holidays where my seat somehow ended up at the far end of the table. Conversations that stopped when I approached. None of it was dramatic. That was what made it effective. Disrespect rarely announces itself. Most of the time it arrives disguised as practicality, concern, or oversight. Across from me, Ethan laughed at something a cousin said. I felt no resentment toward him. He had spent years listening to the same assumptions everyone else repeated. If enough people describe someone as unsuccessful, eventually that description begins to sound like fact. Meanwhile, the reality of my life had been moving in a completely different direction. 18 months earlier, I had started working with a small team on a software platform that many investors considered too ambitious. We faced rejection after rejection. Some meetings lasted less than 10 minutes. Some potential partners never returned calls. There were weeks when progress felt impossible, but every setback forced us to improve. Every obstacle taught us something useful. Slowly, the impossible began turning into the inevitable. Nobody in my family knew any of this. Not because I was hiding it. They simply never asked. The realization was strangely liberating. People who underestimate you often reveal how little attention they have been paying. As dessert menus appeared, my phone vibrated again. This time it was a message from Daniel Foster, my business partner. "Congratulations, Margaret. We did it." The message was short, but seeing it made me smile. Not because of the money, Not because of the deal, because it reminded me of something important. While my family had been busy measuring my value through old assumptions, I had been building a future they could not even imagine. And somewhere beyond the restaurant doors, completely unaware of the role he was about to play in this evening, another person was already on his way. A few minutes after receiving Daniel's message, I excused myself from the table and stepped into the lobby. I needed a moment away from the noise. The restaurant was crowded, but the entrance area was quiet compared to the dining room. Large windows overlooked the parking lot, where the evening sunlight was beginning to soften. I stood there for a moment, reflecting on how strange the day had become. Less than 12 hours earlier, I had expected nothing more than a graduation ceremony and a family dinner. Instead, I found myself watching years of assumptions unfold in real time. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Daniel. I answered immediately. His voice carried the excitement of someone who had been running on adrenaline for days. He congratulated me once more and then laughed. "You are not going to believe what I just learned," he said. That caught my attention. Daniel was not the type of person who enjoyed gossip. He preferred facts, results, evidence. "What happened?" I asked. There was a brief pause before he responded. Earlier that afternoon, he had spoken with a mutual acquaintance who happened to know Vanessa through a local charity committee. During that conversation, the subject of the graduation celebration came up. Apparently, Vanessa had been talking about the surprise she planned for me for nearly 2 weeks. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. "What kind of surprise?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. Daniel sighed. "The envelope." For a moment, I said nothing. The lobby seemed quieter than before. Even the distant restaurant noise faded into the background. Daniel continued. "Vanessa had described the gesture as a way to help me financially while also showing the family how generous she could be. But according to the acquaintance, she had repeatedly joked that everyone would finally see how far I had fallen. She expected the moment to become one of the highlights of the celebration. Not because it would help me, because it would define me." I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes briefly. The information did not shock me as much as it should have. In truth, it simply confirmed what I had already suspected. The envelope had never been about kindness. Genuine generosity is private. Genuine generosity protects dignity. What happened on that lawn had been designed for an audience. Daniel sounded frustrated on my behalf. I was not. Oddly enough, I felt calm. Perhaps because the situation had become so clear. For years, I had wondered whether certain comments were accidental, whether certain exclusions were misunderstandings, whether certain moments meant what they appeared to mean. Now I had my answer. They were not accidents. They were choices. Careful, deliberate choices. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked. I smiled as I looked through the window toward the parking lot. "I am better than all right," I said. For the first time in a long time, everything makes sense. We spoke for another minute before ending the call. As I slipped the phone back into my purse, I noticed a luxury sedan pulling into the restaurant entrance. The driver stepped out and handed the keys to a valet. Even from a distance, I recognized him immediately. Michael Whitmore had arrived earlier than expected, and suddenly, I realized the evening was about to take a direction nobody at that dinner table could have predicted. When I re-entered the dining room, nobody looked up immediately. The conversation continued exactly as I had left it. Ethan was discussing apartment options near his future employer. My cousins were debating housing prices. Vanessa was telling a story that positioned her at the center of yet another successful event. Everything appeared normal. That was the interesting part. Life-changing moments rarely announce themselves with dramatic music or sudden silence. Most of the time, they arrive quietly while everyone is busy paying attention to something else. I returned to my seat and picked up my glass of iced tea. Across the table, my mother noticed me and offered a small smile. There was something different in her expression now, almost as if she sensed that an invisible current was moving beneath the surface of the evening. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager appeared near our table. At first, nobody paid much attention. Restaurants are busy places. Staff members come and go constantly. But then the manager stopped beside me. "Miss Collins," he said politely, "there is someone here asking for you." Several heads turned. I looked toward the entrance and saw Michael Whitmore speaking with a hostess. Even in a crowded room, he was difficult to miss. He carried himself with the calm confidence of someone accustomed to making major decisions. His reputation alone opened doors across multiple industries. Yet what mattered most to me was not his success. It was the fact that he had spent the past 18 months believing in an idea that many others dismissed. Before I could stand, Michael spotted me and smiled. Then he walked directly toward our table. The conversations around us gradually faded. Ethan looked confused. Vanessa looked curious. My cousin Brian straightened in his chair. Michael reached the table and extended his hand. "Margaret," he said warmly, "I apologize for interrupting the celebration, but I wanted to congratulate you in person." I stood and shook his hand. "Thank you, Michael." He laughed. "Thank you? You are the one who just helped close one of the most exciting deals I have seen in years." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. For a brief moment, the only sounds came from distant conversations elsewhere in the restaurant. Michael continued, completely unaware of the shock spreading across the table. $20 million is an impressive milestone, he said. But honestly, the number is not what excites me. The future potential is what excites me. My cousin nearly dropped his fork. Ethan blinked several times as though he had misheard. Vanessa remained perfectly still. The practiced smile she wore throughout the evening had vanished. Michael pulled out a chair and sat beside me for a moment. He spoke about the project, the investors, and the opportunities ahead. Nothing confidential, nothing inappropriate, just enough information to make one fact impossible to ignore. Everything my family believed about my life was wrong, completely wrong. As Michael spoke, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel revenge. What I felt was clarity, because for the first time all day, nobody was looking at the version of Margaret Collins they had invented. They were finally seeing the real one. For several seconds after Michael finished speaking, nobody at the table seemed capable of forming a response. The reaction was not dramatic. It was quieter than that. Forks remained suspended halfway to plates. Glasses stayed untouched. Expressions froze somewhere between confusion and disbelief. The silence fascinated me because it revealed something I had suspected for years. Most people do not struggle when reality confirms their assumptions. They struggle when reality destroys them. Ethan was the first to recover. "Wait," he said carefully. "You built the company Michael is talking about?" I nodded. "I helped build it, yes." His eyes widened. "You never told me." There was no accusation in his voice, only surprise. "You never asked," I replied gently. The answer was not meant to embarrass him. It was simply true. Across the table, several relatives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Suddenly, everyone seemed eager to learn details about my life. The same people who had spent years assuming they already knew everything about me now wanted explanations. Questions came from every direction. How long had I been working on the project? Who were the investors? When did the negotiations begin? What happened after the original setbacks? The irony was impossible to ignore. Earlier that afternoon, nobody had shown interest in my work. Now they could not stop asking about it. Michael answered some questions himself. He spoke about the technology, the growth projections, and the confidence investors had shown during the final stages of the deal. His praise was generous but measured. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply describing facts. Yet every sentence seemed to shift the atmosphere around the table. The version of Margaret Collins that existed in everyone's mind was disappearing piece by piece. Vanessa remained unusually quiet. For most of the evening, she had guided conversations with ease. Now she seemed uncertain where to look. Finally, she forced a smile. "Well, that is wonderful news," she said. I had no idea. Her words sounded polite. Her expression did not. I met her gaze briefly and smiled. "I know," I said. "Nothing more. Nothing less." Michael glanced at his watch and stood. He had another engagement scheduled later that evening and could not stay long. Before leaving, he shook Ethan's hand and congratulated him on graduating. Then he turned back to me. "I will call you Monday morning," he said. "We have a lot to discuss." I thanked him and watched him leave. The moment he disappeared through the restaurant entrance, the table fell silent again. But this silence felt different. Earlier, they had pitted me. Now they were reevaluating me. The shift was impossible to miss. My cousin Brian finally laughed nervously. I guess none of us knew what was really going on. Several people nodded. My mother looked at me with an expression I had not seen in years. Pride. Not because of the money, not because of the business success, because she finally understood something the rest of the family was only beginning to realize. I had never been the person they believed I was. And the more they tried to reconcile that fact, the more uncomfortable the evening became for those who had worked hardest to convince everyone otherwise. The rest of the evening unfolded in a way I never could have predicted. Nobody rushed to apologize. Nobody suddenly transformed into a different person. Real life does not work that way. Instead, the change appeared in smaller ways. The assumptions disappeared first. The certainty vanished. People who had spent years believing they understood my circumstances now realized they had been operating with incomplete information. That realization made them cautious. Questions replaced conclusions. Curiosity replaced confidence. Ethan leaned forward and asked me about the company. Unlike the others, his interest felt genuine. He wanted to understand what had happened during the past 18 months. So I told him, not every detail, not every struggle, just enough for him to see the truth. I explained how a small group of us had identified a problem that larger companies ignored. I explained how difficult it had been to secure funding in the beginning. I described long weeks filled with uncertainty, revisions, and difficult decisions. Several relatives listened quietly. What struck me most was not their surprise regarding the success. It was their surprise regarding the work. Somehow they had convinced themselves that my life had become uneventful, that nothing important was happening. Yet while they were forming those conclusions, I had been building something every single day. Across the table, Vanessa remained unusually reserved. Every so often she attempted to contribute to the conversation, but the confidence she displayed earlier was gone. The center of gravity had shifted, not because of money, not because of status, because facts had entered a story that was previously built on assumptions. Eventually, my cousin Brian asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. Why did you never tell us? Several people nodded. I considered the question carefully before answering. Because nobody asked, I said. The table became quiet again. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just honesty. I explained that for years, most family conversations focused on what people believed they already knew about me. Very few people seemed interested in discovering whether those beliefs were accurate. When someone assumes they understand your entire story, they stop listening. They stop asking questions. They stop noticing change. My mother lowered her eyes for a moment. I could tell she was reflecting on more than just that evening. Perhaps she was remembering moments she wished had unfolded differently. Perhaps she was realizing how easy it is for families to accept a convenient narrative. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan apologized. Not dramatically, not publicly, simply and sincerely. He admitted that he had accepted certain assumptions without questioning them. He admitted that he should have stayed more connected. The apology mattered because it was honest. Honest people do not defend mistakes. They acknowledge them. Vanessa said nothing. The silence itself seemed meaningful. By the time dessert plates were cleared and people began preparing to leave, the atmosphere around the table felt completely different from the one that existed only a few hours earlier. Earlier, I had been viewed through the lens of pity. Now I was being viewed through the lens of reality. Neither perspective was perfect, but one was at least grounded in truth. As we walked toward the parking lot beneath the warm North Carolina evening sky, I realized something important. The most satisfying part of the night was not proving anyone wrong. It was discovering that I no longer needed their approval to feel successful. That lesson had taken years to learn. And unlike the deal, unlike the money, unlike the recognition, it was something nobody could ever take away. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows as I poured myself a cup of coffee and reflected on everything that had happened during the previous 24 hours. The house was quiet. No congratulatory speeches. No dramatic confrontations. No grand declarations. Just silence and perspective. Success has a way of changing how people see you, but it does not always change who they are. That realization stayed with me as I sat at the table and looked at the small white envelope resting beside my coffee mug. The same envelope that had been handed to me in front of relatives, friends, and strangers. The same envelope that had never really been about helping me. For a few moments, I considered throwing it away. Then I changed my mind. Instead, I removed the $50 bill and placed it back inside along with a handwritten note. The message was simple, respectful, direct. I did not mention the deal. I did not mention the restaurant. I did not mention Michael Whitmore or the investors or the company. None of those things mattered anymore. The note simply said, "Thank you for thinking of me. Please keep this. I have learned that people often give others what they believe they need. I hope this finds its way to someone who truly needs it. I sealed the envelope and addressed it to Vanessa. Then I set it aside for mailing. There was no anger behind the gesture, no desire for revenge. The lesson had already been delivered the night before. Nothing else needed to be said. Over the next few weeks, life became busy. Meetings multiplied. New opportunities appeared. The company entered a phase of growth that required nearly all of my attention. Yet the most surprising development involved my family. Several relatives reached out individually. Some wanted to apologize. Others wanted to reconnect. A few admitted they had accepted assumptions about my life without ever questioning them. Those conversations were not always comfortable, but they were honest. And honesty is where real relationships begin. Ethan called often. We spoke more during the following month than we had during several years combined. He asked questions about business, leadership, and resilience. I answered as openly as I could. For the first time in a long while, our relationship felt genuine again. My mother seemed happier too. During one conversation, she told me something I never forgot. She said that people often mistake visibility for value. The loudest achievements receive attention, but the quiet qualities matter more. Character, integrity, persistence, kindness. Those things do not always make headlines, but they determine who we become. Looking back now, I realized the most important moment of that graduation weekend was not the wire transfer. It was not the business deal. It was not even the surprise appearance at dinner. The most important moment happened when I finally understood that my worth had never depended on anyone else's opinion. Not when people admired me, not when people doubted me, not when they celebrated me, and not when they pitied me. People will always judge based on the information they have, and sometimes the information they have is incomplete. That is simply part of life. What matters is continuing forward without allowing those judgments to define you. Because the people who underestimate you are often revealing more about themselves than they are about you. And sometimes the greatest victory is not proving someone wrong. Sometimes the greatest victory is realizing you no longer need to.